Welcome to the Microsoft Cloud Option webinar series. My name is Vivek Bhatnagar. I am a CTO and founder for UnifyCloud. Let's then start talking about the adopt phase. And in adopt phase, we are going to talk first about cloud migration. And as we discussed already, that migration is commonly associated with the term lift and shift or rehost, and that's what we basically call as migration. And whenever you migrate a workload or an application or a database, there are like distinct like four phases that you need to do correctly. And these are phases start like migrate your first workload. So it's basically validate all the assumptions and work you have done. So validate your landing zone, validate your again business outcomes and business justification just to make sure, and then take your first workload and migrate it using different tools. It also talk about various scenarios. So whether you're migrating Linux servers or Windows servers or VMware environment or maybe a BI environment. So there are a lot of scenarios, and each of these scenarios has a little bit different approach. So you may be just moving VMs always, but moving a VM which is hosting a data server or part of a business intelligence solution, a bit different. So the different scenarios that you can support. And again, my goal is not to go again deeper in these scenarios, but just to make aware that these are the different scenarios and need slightly different rehosting approach. Then we talked about a lot of best practices, that what are the best practices you typically see in moving these. So you have to use what tools you have to do, best practice. And finally, once you start doing it and you do it in an iterative fashion, so it's not that you move your all VMs together. You actually, for example, if you have 100 VMs, you might select first 10 VM, which maybe represent a distinct process in your company, and then try to move those 10 VMs. Then you put learning back into the process and then move another next 10 VMs and next 20 VMs and then 30 VMs. So that's how you keep moving. And so how to build that process improvements and other thing would be discussed here. So talk about like first of all, migration effort, like, how do we build migration efforts? The effort required to migrate workload generally fall into three types of efforts or phases, whatever you want to call it, is basically assess a workload, deploy that workload, and release this workload. And in this section, we are trying to understand that what we need to do successfully all these phases. Typically, all these phases can run in another like life cycle fashion. So you can do it for a simpler workloads, you can spend like maybe a couple of weeks. For SAP type of workload, it may be a couple of months, another thing. And all of these things, we call it as migration waves. Migration waves like means that you select a small chunk of your workload. You put through them in a planning cycle based on your strategy, then put through them what you need to in sort of a cloud option plan, and then try to migrate them. So it's kind of a chunk of your workload, chunk of your application, which we call migration waves, and do it. Here again, the assessment piece focus on multiple things. So how do you assess your, for example, virtual machines, and how do you assess your applications? How do you assess your databases? How do you assess your other service or shared services load? So mostly like assessment and what data you need to look at, what things you need to think about. We'll talk about these things. And after assessment, while you're deploying, then how you are deploying, right? Sometimes like you're going to just put a replication engine in place. Sometimes the application engine is not suitable and you just X copy or other things. Sometimes you use other techniques based on the workload. And finally, releasing those workloads. Releasing these workloads is making these workloads available to production. So before making that, you are basically testing, optimizing, and documenting those workloads. So these are the three phases of any iteration of migration efforts, and we keep doing it for a chunk of workloads, which each one of those we call as a migration waves. And so that's a typical terms a lot of consultant use while talking about these migration waves. One thing I just want to also stress out is that to do properly each migration waves, you definitely need to go back and validate whether your planning and your migration zones and other things are working well and or not. So just to start with this, like let's talk about the assessment part first. And in assessment part, uh, the first thing I just typically want to talk about cloud migration guides. Like so, these are like typical guidance. Those are that's basically available for you whenever you look at you start doing this. And it is very simple guidance available on Azure portal, or you can actually find into Microsoft documentations, other things. Uh, this should be used in a as I told you, in a simpler scenarios. This is nothing but my quick start center. You know that there are like two guides which I want you to pay attention. One is the migration guide, and this is where like you can get a lot of information about how do you uh, do a migration. But again, like this migration guide is good when you are doing maybe your first workload migration, which is very simple virtual machines and or virtual machines running particular databases, not anything complex. It should not be any complex compliance requirement. It should not be impacting a lot of users. So it's a really in a simple scenario. I recommend you to use these books, which actually divide into multiple parts, like prerequisite, what you need to do, understand, and then how do you assess the digital state. And we have discussed all these things in detail in our previous discussion. So, but it is mostly again, validating whether you have this information available or not, on what assets you are migrating, how are you going to manage costs and optimize and secure and manage, and finally where you go for a help in case you stuck somewhere. But again, like in case you are doing a complex migration, I highly recommend to talk to Microsoft support people, or get a partner who is very comfortable and will help you in migration. This guide is mostly suitable for a very simple migration or simple things. And then there are innovation guides we'll talk about in our innovation center innovation talks. So migration is again divided into like four simple phases, which we said is assessment, where we go and do assessment for nearly all the assets, and we apply techniques like 5R, which we have discussed before, or we looked at or different tools. Like there are different tools available like Azure Migrate and some of the third-party tool. Like one tool is from UnifyCloud, for which I will take an example and show it. The idea is not to sell that tool to you, but just to give you an idea that what things you have to look at. Then we have a migration. There are Microsoft tools and third-party tools available for migration, which we can look at. Once you migrate, the first thing is to optimize that workload. This is again validating, like, we have right-sized this workload based on our understanding of how these workload were actually deployed and running into on-premise. But a lot more time, we don't get always the correct picture because we collect data maybe just for a couple of days or couple of weeks, and that time that workload might not be performing at their best. So we have to again validate whether workload is running optimally. It's not consuming extra resources or not like having less resource available to it. And finally, once we test it and show it, and then we hand over to the people who are actually doing the security and operationalize that workload. So these are the processes that you typically take in migrating of a VM, which might be running an application. In case you are doing the same thing for a database migration, it is again the same thing, but a little bit different. Like, so for example, like you need to look at your database, and if you're migrating it, you need to make sure that you don't have any problem of like connection strings and other thing. And Microsoft has tool for doing that assessment, telling you, informing you that these things might not work. And then finally replications, and in database there's a cutoff become little critical because you don't want to lose access of the critical applications. So you replicate, and then you actually agree on a migration window, and then you do a cutoff, and then you may connect your applications and database together. Finally, data optimization is important, like aspect of database migration. It is where you test the performance of database and just make sure that it is a better performance, or at least equivalent performance on on-premise, and make sure the data is encrypted and other thing by handling over to security and management team. So this is just a database migration, and these both are lift and shift with little bit difference that how these things happen. Um, In the next few slides, like I'm going to take a snapshot of a tool and give you an idea that how you assess your virtual machine, how you assess different workloads, how you go and assess your application and other aspect of it.